Yeah. Okay.
Can you check the mic?
Check the
Test.
Checking.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you all for coming, and I really want to thank our team with our team leader John Ramelay and Jeremy Lancaster's here. And I know there'll be other team members to introduce, but we really want to thank them for coming and making time for us. The final report just released late in the day on Friday, so we really appreciate you being here at such short notice so that we have the best information possible and that we have a good dialogue with our partner agencies that are here today. So my name is Tammy Moss Chandler. I'm the Recovery Director for Mendocino County, and we first met, actually, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, I'd say. As the Team 4 had boots on the ground and were beginning their assessment for this Watershed Emergency Response Team report. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your findings with us today and sharing this discussion with us today.
So good afternoon, I'm John Ramelay, CAL FIRE forester. A little bit of background on myself. I moved here in 1993. I worked here until the end of 2013 as a forester, and then I came to CAL FIRE in 2014 and moved to Fretting. So I am, this is my home. I am a local. One of my friends' homes got burned in the fire, so I was actually wanted to be a part of this team. And with me is Jeremy Lancaster. He's the co-leader of this team from CGS.
Yeah, I'm a senior engineering geologist with the California Geological Survey, and a little background. I've been working in fires and post-fire debris flows since about 2007 in Southern California, and over the last 3 years I've worked on a handful of these post-fire watershed assessments, looking at values at risk. In my off time in the winter after these fires, what I tend to do is I monitor both flood runoff, stream flow runoff, and debris flows in burn areas. And the reason why that's important, the why part, is that we update our debris flow models with the monitoring data. So we actually make some advancements in the models, and they become more valuable over time.
So we gave a closeout meeting after our 8 or 9 day assessment a couple of weeks ago to the county, and now we'd like to do the final to extended members, extended stakeholders. So brief outline, here the overview of the work process. This is a rapid post-fire assessment. We try to get things done in a week or two and then try to get information out pretty quickly. So we're collecting information, analyzing information, and then disseminating that information on a fairly rapid turnaround. I'll go through here is the, again, it's a rapid inventory of those threats to life and property. There is a phase 2, which may not happen on any of these fires, I'm not sure, but that's one that would actually look at effects to the environment. At this point in time, our phase 1 rapid assessment is primarily based on life and property assessments. Then we develop, after we've gone out there and looked at these, looked at the fire, looked at the soil burn severity, looked at values at risk. That could be areas which may have increased the risk of flooding, increased risk of debris flows. We've noted a lot of undersized culverts and whatnot. Then we'll develop recommendations and protective measures needed to avoid these life safety threats. And then we, of course, as we're doing now, we communicate the results. So here's the, instead of reading the entire slide, we have our kind of a filter for what projects, which fires may result in a work project. So the fact that there's a state and a federal declaration of disaster definitely rose to a high level of need. And Jeremy, I'll let him talk a little bit, because we did what was called a pre-WRT, because there were so many fires that happened all at once that he was part of the pre-WRT assessment, which kind of helped prioritize these fires.
Yeah, so the pre-work team was comprised of four people that are experienced in this post-fire evaluation, two CAL FIRE forester and hydrologists, and then two engineering geologists. And what we did was we met in Santa Rosa right after the fires at the fire camp there. And the first thing that you really need with these assessments is good satellite imagery, or good photos of the burn areas, because you need to understand what burn severity occurred within the burn area, and then what sort of topography was consumed by the wildfire. So part of that process was working with NASA, trying to get satellites tasked so we could get imagery, and then also getting up in a helicopter. We actually flew all the fires and did a aerial reconnaissance of the burn severity, which was kind of a standard method that we used for that. And the way we prioritize, we look at fire size and then location in relation to communities and values at risk. Proximity of the burn areas to developments. We also want to get an understanding on where are the flood hazards and where are debris flow hazards associated with those communities. And from that we go and we prioritize the fires for word assessments. And that's why we are here today, because the Redwood fire was a priority for us.
So, as Jeremy said, that one of the first things we do is the BARC map. That's B-A-R-C, Burned Area Reflectance Classification. What they do is they have imagery of the fire area prior to the fire and imagery of the fire area after the fire, and they compare that, and they're basing it on reflectance of the burn. And as you'll see later on, the soil burn severity, the effects of the fire on the soil, are really one of the key drivers of this entire process. So what we had is we had a Forest Service soil scientist, Brad Rust. He's actually one of the preeminent soil scientists here in the West. He's been on over 100 of these. Typically, he's leading these burned area emergency response teams for the Forest Service. We brought him on as to go out and validate the burned area, or the BARC maps, because we have to have those maps validated and make adjustments to the soil burn severity before we can actually run the modeling, and before Jeremy then can start analyzing it from a debris flow and flood flow characteristics. So here is the team. At this point, it's just going to be Jeremy and I here today, but I gave you a little bit of history of me. Jeremy, Brad Rust is the U.S. Forest Service soil scientist. Scott Kennedy was the Department of Water Resources. He did our hydrology. Craig Pedersen in the back is our local representative from the unit. And Brian Swanson is another CEG working hand in hand with Jeremy. And then Stacy Stanish is a biologist and a forester, and she did our geographic information systems. So here's the process. We assemble the team. It is engineers, hydrologists, foresters. Again, the BARC maps, we meet with the county, field check the BARC maps, send those checked BARC maps after we validated it back to modelers in Colorado, and then they provide us the results. Then they conduct the flood flow modeling, and the surface erosion modeling, the debris flow modeling, all of that comes. So the first step is we have to look at the soil burn severity. That is the main driver of these fires. And then we've also gone out in the field, again, the values at risk. After we get the flood flow models and the debris flow models, even though we've been out in the field, Craig and I and the other team members looking at actual sites on the ground, undersized culverts or slide-prone areas, whatever, we then run the modeling, and then we're looking at areas that would not necessarily stand out as you're driving around, but the debris flow modeling will say that these are areas of elevated risk of either flood flow or debris flow.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. What we do is we take the modeling results, we layer them up into our collector. We load that service onto our iPads, And then we go out in the field and we field check other areas where the modeling suggests there could be a higher hazard that was otherwise not obvious when we were in the field beforehand. So I'll continue. The basis of the evaluation is obviously topography. Steep sloping terrain is going to be more prone to sediment generation, debris flow generation. Soil type, the soil burn severity, as John mentioned, and these inputs help us develop our debris flow models, our flood flow models, our sedimentation models. And again, these are rapid. These are not site-specific modeling results. They are sort of a rapid assessment based on readily available information that help us identify values at risk. So we use those models. We make observations of values at risk. And we, in the field, as we're making these observations, we sort of develop our general recommendations, a general idea. Say we find a culvert that's halfway plugged. Well, if you get an increased flow through that culvert and it's halfway plugged, you could, at minimum, have flow stop up that culvert and go over a road. You could blow out a roadway fill prism and cause, basically a landslide downstream. So we come up with general emergency protective measures that could be implemented prior to intense rainfall. So what happens after a fire? Oh, there's a laser pointer. Okay. There we go. So here you have your fire, right? You have your canopy, so you have conifers, trees, shrubs along the ground, and then you have your soil, which has organic litter and duff in it. When you consume all this material, what you do is you volatilize all of the organic compounds, paraffins, waxes, and that condenses into the soil. And so not only do you have a denuded slope, denuded of vegetation, but you can also develop a hydrophobic layer, which is where those volatilized compounds condense. And that hydrophobic layer doesn't allow water to penetrate, say for the first year following a fire. So water that hits this surface will tend to run off much more rapidly, not only because of the hydrophobic layer, but also because you've now reduced this canopy down to nothing. So if you can imagine, the canopy is kind of an umbrella, right? You have an oak tree or some oak woodlands, and that umbrella acts to reduce the raindrop impact on the soil surface. And so without that canopy there, and then on top of that having the hydrophobic layer, as you start to, the raindrop impact will mobilize more sediment, and it'll run off much faster. So soil burn severity is the most critical thing. As John mentioned, we have to validate the burn area reflectance classification because it's an input to our model. So high soil burn severity, you get high runoff increases. Moderate soil burn severity, tend to be, moderate, sometimes high runoff increases. And then as you get low to low or very low soil burn severity, you get very little or low runoff response. This is a hill slope. Again, this is in Southern California, but it shows a denuded hill slope. And then we had a rainstorm, and you see all this rilling that it brings the water down into these swales. Well, that increased runoff basically caused scour of these channels. And all that sediment will be delivered to the streams, or at least downslope quite a bit. A good percentage of it will. The photo down here is just showing what a hydrophobic soil would look like. When we're in the field, we scrape away the ash and we put water on the scraped away surface, and the water will bead, and that's what you see here. It doesn't infiltrate, and that's because of that, all those organic compounds in that hydrophobic layer. So pre-fire, this is just another slide kind of demonstrating the same thing. Pre-fire, you have here's your hill slope, you have your vegetation and canopy. You burn that post-fire. Now you have nothing there. You have a hydrophobic layer, you get a lot of dry ravel. Light rainfall, could lead to downstream flooding and some erosion and entrainment of sediment and delivered downstream. Heavy rainfall, so high intensity rainfall, like flash flood, think of flash flood type rainfall, can cause rills and gullies and the development of debris flows. So two things that I just mentioned, kind of increased stream flows and sedimentation, and then debris flows being the most hazardous. So this is an example of increased stream flows and sedimentation in the Butte Fire burn area. This is in Calaveras County. And the WERT team came out, and one of our emergency protective measures, our recommendations, was to put in T-posts to sort of minimize the impacts of sediment coming into this culvert. Now, right above this and out of the photo is Jesus Maria Road, which is kind of a main road along the northern portion of the burn area. So that was a value at risk. The road was a value at risk. The traveling public was a value at risk identified there. So we put in, the T-posts were put in, and then about 3 or 4 storms later, you can see, so here's these leading 4 T-posts, and here's 1, 2, this one's down, another one's down in the foreground here, and then the 2 back ones are here. But you can see what these did is they actually impeded all of these gravels from making it to the culvert, which is right here. Quite a bit of finer sediment came into that area, but that's a little easier to deal with. So this is kind of an increased stream flow and sedimentation. This is back the Basin Complex fire in 2008. This is the Big Sur Lodge right here. We had a rainstorm in April 2009. So let me go back a little bit. This is a value at risk identified, the Big Sur Lodge. It was on this alluvial fan down from a really steep catchment. And we recommended they put a K-rail in along the front of the lodge itself. And we had this April 7th, 2009 storm. It was roughly 0.9 inches per hour. That was the rate. And then we had a big debris flow come down. And if you can see, you probably can't, but the K-rail is right here. And this debris flow did not impact the lodge. So this is kind of a definitely a lesson learned for us, and it was hugely successful putting in a simple emergency protective measure. Another example of a debris flow in the Butte Fire burn area, and you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, here's a before photo, here's the after, there's a debris flow, so what, right? Well, there is a road here. This actually came across the road. It's Hover Road is the name of it, and so if you were the traveling public and you were driving through there when this thing came down, you'd probably push your car, hopefully not off the road. But it's just an example of what can occur. Here's some other photos of just landslide impacts, dry gravel in a channel. These are photos of shallow landslides in a burn area that are contributing sediment into this ravine. So John, you want to talk about the fires? You want this? You want this? Is that the microphone's much better than the podium?
Oh, okay. So this is a map of all of the fires that impacted primarily the Russian River. You can also see this is all of the wine country fires or North Bay fires, but the Atlas fire was primarily in the Napa River, but the Nuns and the Tubbs impacted the Napa and the Russian River. The Pocket Fire was all in the Russian River, and then of course the Redwood Fire is all in the Russian River. So when you added all those fires up, about 9% of the entire Russian River watershed burned. Of all of the fires, I believe the Redwood Valley, which although it's 65% of it is low to very low, it still had more severity than the other fires. These were all extraordinarily fast-moving fires that didn't sit and didn't burn the soil very hot. They just blew across, and of course it was devastating to homes and to people, but as far as what we've seen on the ground, overall, these fires were fairly low impact. The upper Eel River, That includes the Willits watershed and then the area that drains into Van Arsdale, which is just a very small portion of the entire eel. Here's the fire summary for this is 1951 to present. Not a lot of fire activity. If you were to look at the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, the one that burned Fountain Grove and Coffey Park, there was I think it was called the Hanley Fire in 1964, and it's a virtually identical footprint. Started in St. Helena and burned all the way to Santa Rosa, just like it did this last time. This, we haven't seen as much fire activity in the last, since 1951. Here is these are the statistics. 32% of the East Fork Russian River, 57% of the main stem, and 11% of the upper Eel. Here's it's all private land, essentially. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's actually, at the end of the report, you'll see what's called a burned area emergency response that the Bureau of Indian Affairs did for the Redwood Valley Rancheria. And they kind of came to the same conclusions that we did. The BLM had 182 acres, almost all of it, 97% or so was private lands. Again, and Brad Russ, the soil scientist that's included in the Redwood Fire report, he does a really good job explaining the methodology used for soil burn severity classifications. And again, it is the primary driver. Even though moderates and highs, and I'll let Jeremy speak more to that, they're modeled fairly similar, I believe, but in reality, highs react much differently than moderates. According to at least discussions with Drew. I don't know if you have any. And then the lows and the very lows aren't very big drivers to the model. Again, this is taken out of the report that Brad put together. Low soil burn severity, you'll see a little hydrophobicity on top. Once you scrape down a little bit, it's gone. High burn soil severity, you'll actually see the soil change. You'll see it'll start getting fluffy. So you don't put water on the ash, it'll suck right in, but as soon as you scrape away that ash layer and go to the soil layer, you'll start seeing that kind of that water repellent layer. Again, 65% is very low to low, 34% moderate, 1% high. The highs that we saw out in the field were primarily, even though the Poly Ranch, there was some conifer on theirs that burned high. For the most part, it was south-facing slopes with typical fire-prone species like yerba sante, buckbrush, chamise. These are areas that fire is actually part of their ecology, and that's what they use. And that's primarily where we were seeing the fires, the high burn soil severities. And I'll let you.
Okay, these are the results of the USGS's post-fire debris flow model. And what you can see, and I'll explain the colors here. It's a colorful map. The red is high debris flow probability, and this very light color out here is very low debris flow probability, and then the colors in between are low. Moderate is this darker brownish orange. So in general, we have these tributaries to the East Fork Russian River, which are Boys and Bush Creek. This is Bush Creek, and this is Boys Creek. This is sort of the main hot spot in the burn area, and we expect increases in flows and sedimentation, and perhaps debris flows coming out of these smaller basins. This smaller watershed here also models out as high, and so we expect the potential for debris flows to exist here for a couple years. But in general, what we saw in the burn area, because most of it is low burn severity, right? So that last statistic, it's like 2/3 of the burn area is low burn severity. We expect that, if debris flows do occur, they're going to be isolated. And this map kind of shows you where the hot spots, where the most severe debris flow potential occurs. So as you can see, we modeled using a design storm of just about 1 inch per hour, and 24 using that input value and the soil burn severity map. We get 24 of 258 basins have a 50-50 chance of producing a debris flow. So that was the debris flow model. This is how we model. How we model increases in peak flow on the streams, the tributaries, and both the East Fork and Middle Russian River. We place pour points on the map. They're basically analysis points where from that point, we encapsulate all of the watershed area draining to that point. We take the soil burn severity map and we calculate the percentage burned at moderate and high within that area. Oops, sorry. And we use regression equations to come up with changes in peak flow. So we look at what a standard 2-year storm or 10-year storm peak flow would be, and then we apply an equation using the burn severity to model the increase in flow. And that's what the next slides will show. And we use this, again, we place these points where there's sort of, critical infrastructure values at risk. In this case, you have a water supply and flood control reservoir here. You'll find this table in the report if you would like to pore over it. But what it shows is there's some more severe areas. And again, Boys Creek is right up there at the top. Bush Creek's pretty high, almost 45% increase in flow. So here's the pre-discharge, post-fire discharge. This is the percentage increase. So going forward, just picking out the 2 highest increases in flow, Coral Creek and Boys Creek. So Coral Creek is on the Redwood Valley side here, and Boys Creek is here. And again, Boys Creek's showing roughly a 70% increase in flow. And that corresponds to how the debris flow model suggests that there's a higher potential for debris flows in this area. And then we modeled hill slope erosion using an erosion model. It's called ERMIT. This was the work of our soil scientists, and estimated that the estimated erosion is about 15 to 30 tons per acre for 50% of the fire. And then the whole fire average is 15 tons per acre, but erosion rates go as high as 57 tons per acre. And those correspond to these red patches here. So this is the upper Potter Valley, kind of around the PG&E penstock. These are the hill slopes above the Redwood Valley Rancheria. And then there's a lot of internally draining high erosion rates here on the west side of Redwood Valley. Take it over.
So we had 61 sites, identified values at risk. That includes, actually points such as individual homes or culverts, and also polygons, which may include multiple home sites. This is the breakdown of, I'm sure there's probably more bridges out there. 5 of the bridges we saw, either the superstructure, which is the footings that hold the bridge, or the bridges themselves were compromised. 22 culverts, low water crossings. I'll go back a little bit. One of the reasons I wanted a pour point in Corral Creek was noting that it's an unnamed road just north of Jenkins Road. Jenkins Road, the bridge burned out, so they had a low water crossing, and so everybody started shifting up north using that unnamed road. And there's actually quite a bit of home sites that use that unnamed road. And Jenkins Road itself, that bridge is obviously highly compromised. There was no drainage structure that I could see in the temporary crossing, so I'm not sure what will happen with that. But somebody put in a temporary crossing over the Russian River itself, and hoping that's been pulled. And that was one of our bars.
So essentially it's an impoundment.
It's an impoundment, yeah. Here is...
The story I've heard on that, I haven't physically looked at it, is that PG put that in and it was pulled.
Okay.
But I haven't physically looked.
Yeah, there was actually somebody camping there, but this was a couple of weeks ago. The bridge is gone, but and so everybody's rerouted to. And so what they can do is they can use the unknown.
Temporary crossing below
That got pulled.
bridge on Jenkins. I understand they put that in to get their equipment in and out for power, because there is one house back there at least that survived, but they pulled that crossing.
Okay.
That's what I was told. I don't know for sure.
Okay. And so we do these damage inspections for, let's say for Redwood Valley, they'll send out DINs, these damage inspectors, and they'll fill out these reports. And so they kind of took that example for filling out when CAL FIRE does a damage inspection, and they created this similar thing for these values at risk. And so we're using similar tools so we can capture it with a photo. It puts its place on the general map on the left, and then its more specific location on the right, and it gives you the site number, gives you the field observation, the potential hazard to life, potential hazard to property. So these are a couple examples. There is one of the bridge sites. This bridge is actually sat down about a foot, and then the superstructure, which is the footings of the bridge, have been compromised. This is one sheet of the 3. This also includes the general recommendations. Again, I emailed out to Sarah this morning the location of the entire report, and I just emailed her out a little while ago another location. So there's, I think this morning I sent it out to everybody that was on the original meeting notice, but I sent it to Tammy and Sarah to send that second location out. And then, so we have a series of tiled maps. We have 11 maps.
Could you show them the recommended EPM on the table? Just the third to the last column.
Yeah. So, right, what Jeremy's talking about is here's the protection measures or the measures that we've come up with. A lot of these are just storm patrol. We saw. There's a lot of culverts. I work in the timber industry, and so there's a fairly high level of we have to actually install structures to meet a 100-year storm. There's a lot of culverts out there that are private that wouldn't actually meet the forest practice rules, so they're undersized, and these are actually going to people's homes. And so we actually we did denote quite a bit of undersized culverts. Some appeared to be on the county roads. We're not sure. I mean, some of the roads in Potter Valley are very old. They've been there a long time. So we never did size those particular structures. Most of the bridges, there was just a box culvert or two that had some, one actually had some wood footings, I think, to help protect from erosion. That got burned off. And then at the bottom, we also have our general recommendations. A lot of it is early warning systems, especially for these flood-prone areas. Mendocino County has a voluntary system that you can sign up for, but we recommended some of the National Weather Service alerts. So again, here's the tiled maps, and I'll just scroll through these. If anybody wants to stop, I put them all in. This just actually shows you the basin, the debris flow risk, and then the individual site. That number corresponds to the Excel spreadsheet table that tells you what the value at risk really is. And then see if there's any polygons. Yes, and then you've got some polygons like at the bottom of Bush Creek here. There was that, and that whole road has actually got all of those low water crossings, but the polygons might represent a series of structures or a series of homes that are in areas that have an increased risk for debris flow. As you'll notice, there's you'll see some discrepancies between the the 100-year flow and then the actual streams. That's just because the data on the USGS maps doesn't match what's actually on the ground, and especially in Potter Valley, things have been modified for over the years. So the modeling is correct. It's just the actual, these stream zones are based on the USGS.
Yeah, what they do here is you have, I see the pointer actually. You have the debris flow probability model, and then you have these segment hazards, which correspond to the water course or the drainage network. And then what the USGS does is they provide an extra piece of information here, which is not an analytical result. They basically take the stream network and they put it on here and they call it a watch stream segment, and it's just an advisory thing. They put it on there because it's suggestive of where a sediment or debris flows coming off these hill slope steep catchments can impact these water courses, and sediment can be delivered down onto the valley flats. Now the problem with this is that the 10-meter DEM in these areas where there's been a lot of anthro modification due to people are farming in here, they're modifying water courses. That and just the coarse nature of the DEM on flat lands, it's not representative. But in general, as these watch stream segments get to the canyon mouth, they're pretty accurate with respect to the water course. But the main thing we look at down here on the tributaries and the main stem of these river systems is the flood hazard layer. So we look at the FEMA flood hazard layer, and that's what this map shows is the FEMA 100-year floodplain and the values at risk that we identified that are within the floodplain.
You know, while you're there, it means you use that one. So the dark blue line identified as watch stream. So above that is where you actually show the Williams Creek floodplain, the hatched area. So you're basically saying that, and I know where that is. That's not a defined stream, but there is, people get high water in their fields through there. So the idea of it being modified by agriculture activity makes sense. So I find that interesting. The real creek is over where the hatched area is, but then this watch stream isn't really, you couldn't walk out saying there's a creek very well.
No.
So I'm correct in that.
That's correct.
The blue line is, it's not very well defined. The floodplain's actually to the north.
That I believe that's correct. I think that FEMA, to do this, although this is this is an A zone and not a AE or a zone that has base flood elevations. Yeah. But I imagine.
Just for Carmel's sake, between the dark blue line and floodplain, that's where Lee Howard's property is. Just
Yeah, but I would rely so in the valley areas, rely on the FEMA model because they likely used better elevation data than what the USGS had for this.
Right where you're drawing this, there is standing water right now.
Right now?
I mean, that absolutely is accurate.
Okay.
I just never could figure out why you had the dark blue line.
Yes.
One plane above.
Yeah, and I put a disclaimer in the report that describes the reason why we think that these watch stream segments are a little off.
Well, and most of them line up pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is, because the USGS mapping goes back to basically 38 and 39, that maybe that's where they were on original maps, and then as they've updated the maps to where the farmers move stuff around, that's where the floodplains are. Okay.
For the 10-meter DMs in some areas, they used the topography to redevelop a digital elevation model with a 10-meter by 10-meter square area, which is not a great way to develop an accurate elevation model, I don't think. Because the topography is the depiction from the people who created the topographic map. Okay.
And again, I'll just go through the 11 tiles. If anybody had any questions, you could ask me to stop. You can see, here's the, actually the road I was talking about was, I believe, Jenkins Road. It might be here, actually. Anyway, that was the road with the bridge I was talking about. To the north. Oh, okay. So, again, general recommendations. This is kind of a standard for most fires, regardless of the severity, is because we know fire does have an impact. There is some high, there is quite a bit of moderate, so we want the early warning systems. There's actually a pretty good write-up. We put in there the voluntary system that Mendocino County has, but then Jeremy added all of the other watch systems that flash flood warnings, gives a very good description of what each one means. And that's actually a primary one because we know fire impacts it. We know that, let's say a particular storm may be maybe half as much rain provides a response that's similar to what that one storm would be. So that's why, for the next couple of years, fire does impact these areas.
I'd like to add something to the recommendation, just since if you go back. Yeah, so one thing that's worth noting, and we have National Weather Services here, is that in these in flashy systems, and we expect burn areas to behave as very flashy, so rapid runoff and the concentration of flow in channels, and in some cases isolated debris flows such that we kind of may expect here, is that rainfall gauges in the burn area don't give you much advanced warning time. Studies have shown that that debris flows can be triggered by rainfall on the order of 15-minute durations, right? So if you have a gauge in the burn area, by the time you reach that threshold that will produce a debris flow, you have zero warning time or very little. So the important thing is, tuning in to what the National Weather Service is doing with their flash flood watches and warnings. They will likely be using radar. And the radar is going to give you more advanced warning than a precip gauge in the burn area.
So I could go through the last.
I think you leave it.
Okay.
I don't need to talk about it.
All right. So that then concludes our report. There is some additional slides. I did make a copy, made it as a PDF, and gave that to Sarah. There is some additional slides at the end. It just talks again about soil burn severity and some of the studies in the past. And in 2015, we had the Valley Fire. It actually burned up one of our state forests. And yes, it was a loss, but we've also taken that as an opportunity to do some really in-depth research on soil burn severity and soil erosion. And so we're still collecting data, but this is an ongoing project between CGS and CAL FIRE, and I believe the Water Board is involved in that as well. So again, it's yes, we lost the 3,300 acres due to fire, but I think we're going to get some really important information. So far, the preliminary information, they were able to use some of it for the Santa Rosa fires. They felt it was appropriate because the geology between the two fires was fairly similar based on volcanics. However, in Mendocino, the geology here is largely the Franciscan belt, so we didn't feel like it was really, at this point in time, it's still inconclusive whether or not that would mirror over to what our fires are. So I'll conclude the presentation. Anybody has any questions?
And if I get too long-winded, you can just tell me to shut up and we'll talk afterwards. So because I read the summary, the word key findings are important, page 1. So the fourth bullet, it says, 50% or greater reduced post-fire debris flow using a 0.94 inches per hour threshold. I'm assuming that's the flash flood. Almost an inch an hour. Yeah, that's coming down.
Yeah.
I get that. I wonder though, would it mobilize or debris flows happen as the whole watershed gets wetter? I'm assuming that probably gets worse as you get, if we get between 30 and 40 inches average in this burn. So
Yeah.
as you get half of that, 20 inches,
Mm-hmm.
you probably debris flow sooner. Probably.
Yeah.
And that, I'm assuming, is the actual failures where you actually get the flow that
Yeah.
fails and breaks. Your very next bullet talks about a 10-year event producing 15 tons an acre and just increased settlement load. So I'm assuming that would be, we're just going to expect higher erosion rates
Yeah.
in general. So
Absolutely.
the inch an hour is going to do what I call the little collapses, where you actually get those rills you were talking about, where you
Yeah.
literally take a chunk of soil and it just
Yeah.
moves. And
That's
just
an erosion, yeah.
falls
It's
apart.
it's
Yeah.
a superficial erosion thing
Right.
that entrains material, dumps it into the water courses. Yeah, but that's a very complex. It's a very complex question you just asked. But the main thing, if you can just in your mind think about post-fire hydrology, is a flashy runoff response and superficial erosion, but in like a rain year we had last year, you get 60, 70 inches of rain over this burn area. Well, especially if it's gentle and it's not going to cause a lot of runoff, you start to, increase your infiltration. That water gets into the colluvial material on the hill slopes, starts to saturate it. Then you're going to start having shallow landslides, and that's shallow landslides is not what we usually identify in the post-fire setting, because it's something that happens without fire, or it doesn't matter if it's burned or not. Yeah.
60 or 70 inches like we did last year. 'Cause last year was an extremely
Yeah.
unusual year, so
Yeah.
let's hope for the 40 inches
Yeah.
average.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a debris flow on Cow Mountain onto a county road after some little puny 20-acre fire up there.
Mm-hmm.
And the deal was, the whole thing burnt off. I only got one in one place. But once I got it, the crew fought it all winter, because once it starts, they just seem to keep
Yeah.
coming and coming and
Yeah.
coming. Because once that breaks, and it's only one portion,
Mm-hmm.
it just, the water just keeps concentrating
Yeah.
there, and it keeps getting worse until it runs its course.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
once
Yeah.
one forms, you've got a problem.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing that that we don't have for this area is a good shallow landslide or landslide inventory. If we had a really up-to-date landslide inventory, we could do better with providing some predictive tools where those could occur. But we have a post-fire debris flow model, and that's what we run with for these WERT assessments. But yeah, it's very complex. Different types of things can happen.
Are you going to fly it or look at it through the winter to look for things forming? Is there any plans to do that?
I'm still recovering and trying to formulate a plan for monitoring this year. So we have all these fires. Boys and Bush Creek, if I was going to monitor anywhere, it'd be in there. The problem for me there is that any time that I get on or near private land, things get a little dicey.
But from the air, are there any reconnaissance from the air?
Good question. We do not have drones right now. No, we should. No,
Can you get the Defense Department to bring a satellite over?
So we're working on a drone monitoring plan, but being a state agency, we have to go through all sorts of hoops.
Right.
But on the ground and actually putting in rain gauges, other things like cameras, pressure transducers to monitor increase in flow in channels. Yeah, I can do that. But that's boots on the ground work and not remote. Yeah. Chris?
Just two questions. The design storm of 0.9, how was that selected? And then is there a lower threshold of intensity that starts to trigger concerns?
The 0.94 is about the middle of the road rainfall input that's used in California. The actual triggering threshold goes down in areas like Southern California, like the transverse ranges. You can almost half that, but we don't have good information up here on rainfall that produces post-fire debris flows. So we kind of use a middle, like an average threshold input.
What is storm frequency?
It's if you look at the 15-minute duration, you're probably in the 2 to 5 year range. Yeah, you can. I hadn't actually. No, we do have a section in here that talks about different durations, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I'm sure it's between 2 and 5.
As far as continuing monitoring, that Boys and Bush Creek is near the Poly Ranch, and we do know that they are working with scripts. And so we have started to interact with them. We just haven't formulated a plan after that, but they do have monitoring data on site. And so we just started to connect with them, but we haven't formulated anything after that.
What script?
Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego, UC San Diego. Yeah, they're doing the East Fork Informed Reservoir Operations Forecasting. Yeah, and they're that's actually, thanks John for reminding me about that. Yeah, there is potential to team up with them and do some more robust debris flow monitoring in that area as well, because they have their soil monitoring network and precip gauges as well. So I think it's a good idea to reach out to them and work with them.
I just want to mention, because you highlighted flash flood warnings, but if we are watching radar and we see rainfall amounts that look below that threshold, but still significant, we'll issue a flood advisory.
A flood advisory.
So to answer your question, whether it comes in lower, that'll do the flood advisory.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
looking out in the future, if we see 24 hours out, that if we didn't hit the flash flood threshold, we would go with a flood watch.
A flood watch. Okay.
So that kind of
Yeah.
keeps you paying attention, and then we
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is that because of the fire? Is a lower intensity threshold keeping?
Yes. Following the lead of this group on those thresholds.
Yeah.
How much lower? Like if it's 0.94, where would you kick in the watch?
I can tell you, for a watch,
Yeah.
our threshold for watch is lower to get only up to about 50% confidence. So but we don't issue very many flash flood watches or flash flood warnings anywhere in northwestern California. We just don't have that kind of flooding behavior. So,
Yeah.
so I would say that's where it's really different, that we're going to be watching it and be prepared to issue it where we
Yeah.
would normally not do so. All of our rivers and creeks can respond pretty quickly around here anyway, and they typically do that during stratiform rain events with some embedded higher rain amounts. So
Mhm.
not like in Southern California or Arizona where it can be sunny out and suddenly a river's full of water.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit
Yeah.
different. So we're kind of almost acting more like we're in a flash flood prone area.
Yeah.
That makes any sense.
Well, other than, when the public gets a warning, if you do it enough, it's like the little boy who cries wolf. You're right. I would agree. We tend to get the jet stream, frontal type storms that tend to just soak us,
Right,
and they don't
right.
tend to hammer
Yeah.
like they do in the south part of the country in those kind of embedded,
Yeah.
thunderclap type things. So, I mean, at some point, if my boss back there asked me, should I be worried about this, Howard, I'm going to wonder, well, what are you really calling a warning? How many inches? And, I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't really start worrying about, or let's say the history and let's take our last big flood in 05, 06 New Year's. We had 12 inches of rain in 4 days. Now, I'm not saying we need something that dramatic, but let's say 4 or 5 inches of rain in 2 days is where we would normally worry. So if we're calling out big warnings at an inch or two
But
in
if
2
you-
days, that's what I'm saying. When are you going to call them? Where
But
are we?
that's
gonna
an
be?
inch in 1 hour.
Yeah, but you never know that usually, unless you're looking at the storm, or do you? You
Well,
can tell if there's
yeah, no, if we-
something intense in there. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah, no,
Okay.
that's a really good point. So there's the long range flood forecasting for the main stems, and it's a really different process. And then there's really talented young people like William here who are watching the radar and watching the cells move into the area. And right now our entire office is on full alert to watch for any rain cells that
Yeah.
move over that burn scar. that might produce an inch-an-hour threshold rainfall.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a very different mechanism. We're more in like the mode we would be in for tornado country. It's very different. We'll actually staff someone on the radar full time to just watch it for you.
So when you issue one of those, we're looking for debris. Well, you know, whatever.
I wasn't kidding. I mean that.
But if you see 4, 5, 6 inches, that's your normal river flood warnings.
Right. And that's
so you'll differentiate between the two.
Yes.
Okay. So it'll be a debris flow, flash flood, but not necessarily people in the floodplain worrying. This is important to the people who are going to put the notices out.
Absolutely. Another consideration is the dissemination for a river flood is different because there's longer time. But for a flash flood warning, we would act. A flash flood warning would activate the wireless emergency alert that would turn on all cell phones. But here's a really great news: only in the polygon around that burn scar. Now we made it bigger than the actual burn scar because the impacts might extend out of the burn scar. But you're going to really hit a pretty limited population with that flash flood warning. I mean, it will interrupt TV and radio stations, but as far as like waking people up on their phones, only in the area that's impacted. So it's a great new technology. Yeah.
One thing I've noticed in my monitoring, because I look at radar all the time for monitoring and actually take radar screenshots, is there's a phenomenon that I think happens in this area. It's called a narrow cold frontal rain band. You guys have heard that before? It's kind of like a stream of convective cells, and that's been a major producer for debris flows in the Butte fire burn area, and I think the one that we had in the Valley fire burn area. But the rates were nuts. They were like, I think the Valley fire was like 1.5 inches per hour.
You can rest assured usually going off. If we see 1.5 per hour.
Yeah.
The lead time, you might ask, what's the lead time in that? Give us a good rough range of lead time. If you're on the radar watch, how far out would you feel comfortable going?
Probably
15 minutes. So yeah.
Okay.
Pretty certain of that.
Okay.
The watch will have been issued already because the setup is looking right.
Mm-hmm.
And we would give enough lead time for someone to take some kind of proactive measure.
Okay.
So I'm Devin Jones, Mendocino County Farm Bureau, and so I've got members downriver, of course, and I haven't read the report yet, so I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
How far downriver was the impact analysis for us in terms of debris field flow?
Mm-hmm.
Impact, I got guys who pull pumps, who have quite a bit
Yeah.
overload islands in the main stem
Yeah.
in the Butte Valley area, so I'd like to kind of give a heads up what you're using.
Yeah, so let me get back to a representative slide here. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so in general, we didn't go beyond, for the riverine flood hazards, we did not go beyond about a mile from the perimeter. In some cases, we went a little further out, especially in Potter Valley, because the FEMA flood zone was mapped all the way up in those areas. So we did tag some homes and roads, but generally only about a mile outside of the burn perimeter. Yeah, exactly. So what we've done is we've provided a debris flow analysis for the near hill slope areas, so where there's homes and infrastructure right around the steep sloping terrain, and then we use an erosion model to describe how much sediment could come off those hill slopes as well, and then we use the flood hazard model to tell us where we should expect flooding to occur, and we tag in those areas. But we did place, points where we modeled changes in runoff further outside of the burn area, but our values at risk assessment, we did not extend down to those points. That would simply take us a whole nother week.
Yeah, one of the things, about a third of the fire is going to be attenuated by Lake Mendocino. And then the 2/3 to the west, the stuff up Reeves Canyon, Mill Creek, Forsyth Creek, overall was a fairly low burn severity. Was fairly low burn severity in the Willits watershed. I did reach out to Russian River Flood Control, Willits, City of Willits, Calpella, Millview. I just had a discussion basically on all the water systems, and so That was part of the reason that we, as Jeremy said, there was a time limitation. Plus, it was just looking at the nature of the fire and the fact that about 35% of it is going to be going into the lake, and the other, as you got further west, as you can see, the burn severity actually started to lessen.
Just a follow-up question on Devin's point. So is that tons per acre of the erosion, is that detached or delivered to a watercourse, and what's the increase overall for the watershed that you would expect, and how might that affect sediment loads in the main stem?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer, and some of that. So yes, it is the general sediment erosion from the hill slope. So it's just an erosion rate, and it's not a delivery. It's not an actual delivery rate. You could tag Brad Rust, our soil scientist, who's got an idea, because he's done 100 of these, on how much of that could be delivered to each watercourse. But some of that is dependent on, you have a hill slope and you have a fire and it's patchy. You need connectivity in that moderate to high burn severity. You need connectivity all the way to the stream. But in a lot of cases, what we see up here is we have a burn patch, and then we have in the riparian zones and the ravines, all of the veg is still intact, and there's still a lot of veg on the hill slope. So there's not full connectivity from the upper hill slopes to the lower hill slopes, and then that is going to attenuate a lot of sediment down into the valley flats, I would imagine. But I don't have a number. I think it's really, it would be hard to come up with. You could probably do it for a catchment, but for the whole fire, it would be difficult to do.
Did you look at a percent increase in erosion overall? You cited the values, but did you look at, typically you get like 1 ton per acre.
Yeah, we show there's a table in the back of the report that shows, I believe it shows the percent increase, and we also have the 2-year storm modeled in there as well, and so there's a comparison between them. That's in an appendix.
Yeah, Jay Jasper, Sonoma County Water Agency. Can you comment a little bit on your assessment of impacts on the
That is probably a better question for a hydrologist to answer. But we did model the East Fork all the way down to the confluence with Lake Mendocino. I think, do we have I don't know if we have the results up here.
Yeah, we modeled it down to the USGS gauge. That's been.
Go back. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so here's our pour point. Here's our analysis point here. And so we've modeled the whole East Fork. So we have the statistics on it. Let me go to that. East Fork, Russian River. I believe this is it. So only, for this one, we only expected an 8% increase at the confluence, an 8% increase in flow. And, this is really an advisory, right? Because we're taking a pre-fire regression equation, and then we're using another set of equations to model post-fire changes in runoff. I'm not sure that we had. I'd have to look back at the report, but I don't think that we had good peak flow information at that point. So there may be a range in error just in our regression analysis. So 8%. Could be higher, could be lower, but we don't have sedimentation information. What you can expect is higher. The first 4 or 5 storms, a lot of ash and higher turbidity, and that's what we've seen in a lot of these burn areas. It's something to be expected. So if you've got water treatment facilities or anything like that, expect more turbidity.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you. The report was just released Friday. A lot of people may not have had a time to digest. Typically, we like to release the report allow people to digest, but I realized that there were some time-sensitive things that we wanted to come here and to present this to you. So I'm happy to do it, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact Jeremy or I or any of the other team members. I can give you their contacts if you need, or you can just email one of us and we can give you their contacts.
Thank you, John. So while we have John and Jeremy here, we actually wanted to share a couple of things that the county has done since we had our preliminary work findings, and get feedback from both our stakeholders as well as our work team members on any suggestions for next steps, knowing that if everyone hasn't read the work report yet, there may be other suggestions that come out of this. But one thing that I know John could talk more about this, but one thing that happened right in about the first days that you were getting your initial variables at risk report and information coming in, we actually had a mission task that was already occurring around an emergency protective measure with Chief Gonzalez and his team locally with CAL FIRE, and we had deployed some special watershed protective measures along the Russian River first and looking at the other watershed areas, and that team led by CAL FIRE actually went out with the initial variables at risk. And I don't know if you have that slide. Do you have that on the slide? I thought I saw it on an earlier slide, the bar spreadsheet. It's hard to see from up here, but yeah. So we had our Department of Transportation. We had a couple of folks there. We had Environmental Health. We had our state partners with Caltrans and CCC and CAL FIRE. And they went out and actually did an initial analysis of the culverts on the private property because they were already in those areas looking at the watershed. And just did an initial review to see if there was any visible debris at that point. And made sure that there was a GPS kind of reading of where those were for any additional storm patrol. But one thing you mentioned, Jeremy, that's been puzzling for us as we take next steps and we look at storm patrol going into the winter is as it started to rain, we've done some additional storm patrol with our local staff members, but these are almost all culverts on private property. So this aspect of doing storm patrol and monitoring on private property, what we've done is we put together a draft debris flow model plan that we're looking to refine and put any additional information from your final report in that actually talks about what National Weather Service will be providing for us, looks at our local system, looks at our early warning systems that we need to put in place. But one thing we've been contemplating is additional education for private property owners around doing their own storm patrol as people go back onto their land. So we'd love any feedback, and if you want to add anything else of what the team did, or we have the chief here if there's anything else that wants to be added, but anything else we should be thinking about incorporating into our plans, particularly since so much of the burn area, really the vast majority of all the culverts damaged, all the bridges damaged, they're all private, no public land. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, we did recognize that most of the values at risk that we identify were private, and there are a lot of bridges. We just have a general recommendation of a qualified professional. I mean, these are your drainage structures and your access to your homes, and I think it's everybody's kind of due diligence to if there could be some educational material to get out. As far as you do have a response after fires, and there was a lot of culverts that some of the culverts were burned, some of the culverts were partially plugged. Chief Gonzalez and they did some clearance around some of the material, some of the culverts, as Tammy stated, once we started coming up with these values at risk. But yeah, I think the education is a big part of this.
I'll tell you, the second big thing that we did is that we requested support from our state partners and our federal partners, because we don't have the geologists and hydrologists and engineering folks on our own county team to do some of the analysis, Jeremy, that you recommended around analyzing and prioritizing other emergency protective measures, such as implementing K-rails, where appropriate. So this piece of determining where is where appropriate, any other suggestions? So we certainly pulled on some of our local partners, and especially partners who are working in private property, but any other suggestions you have of taking those next steps?
Yeah, I think you can use the values at risk identified in the report, and they are kind of pre-prioritized in a sense because we show the high hazard to life or the high hazard to property, and you can couple that with the debris flow model results to identify areas where you're probably going to need to implement something that should be robust enough to handle a lot of sediment. So K-rails, things like that, sandbags and K-rails. You could use that as kind of a prioritization tool, but ultimately, and this is something that we don't do because we're sort of in an advisory role with this rapid assessment, is ultimately someone needs to go out and look at the location. Typically debris flow hazards, the bad areas are right at the canyon mouths or within the canyons, and then anywhere where streams make sharp bends is usually where debris flows will decide not to stay in the channel, jump out of the channel, they'll avulse, and homes in those areas it's a bad location. But you really need to have someone look at the site-specific information and identify the type of mitigation that is appropriate, and then where. Again, I think I said this in our pre-closeout meeting, was that you don't put K-rail, if you got a stream that's flowing this way, you don't put K-rail perpendicular to that flow direction, right? It's just going to ride along down with the debris flow. You need to angle it. You want to train the debris flow. So at channel bends, you want to train that debris flow back into the channel. You want to keep it in the water course. Yes?
From your previous experience, have you partnered
We've worked with NRCS with their EWP program, and I think they have done really well with providing guidance to the public. They have fact sheets, and the fact sheets I think have been sent out from the Watershed Clearinghouse back in Sacramento. They have a geologist in the region. They would be the likely ones. Yes? Okay.
That site, if they want us to come out, it's all, they need to request it from us. And for the most part, things haven't been nice. I was out at something this morning, and the amazing. So a lot of things that we've been going to see are, it's not going to be as bad as we think it is. Hopefully. So we can talk some more about that, but we have been doing some public.
Yeah, I think there was a great forum that Devin Jones and the Forum Bureau hosted last week with some of the assessments that NRCS is able to do locally, and then we've been working with RCD because this is actually, I guess, the first time that funding's quite rolled out like this, where that FEMA's allowed some non-competitive hazardous mitigation grant funding to potentially look at some strategies to implement. But again, the challenge is these are private properties, so RCD has been a great partner looking at what might we be able to do with this very quick turnaround of right now a deadline at the end of this month to apply for this funding to do some potential mitigation. So one of the reasons we wanted you to come today is if there was anything that will help inform that application. We're talking about it in front of our Board of Supervisors tomorrow, and wanting to make sure we had the best information possible for any of those strategies that could come into play. And then the other thing that's in addition to the hazardous mitigation grant funding and NRC looking at the EWP funding, and then long-term hazardous mitigation grant funding, which will be available for this event to apply for next year, but it will be competitive, is that the Watershed Clearinghouse just rolled out an example. I think both of you might have referred to this. There was a report, an after report from the Bear processes, or maybe it was the Wirt processes from the Valley fires and the Butte fires 2 years ago, and they did kind of an additional assessment afterwards in a large report, and they're offering that as a potential resource after this. So I don't know if either of you are familiar with that report that they did out of the Watershed Clearinghouse process.
I'm familiar with a few reports, and one of them was a guidance document on how to step through the process. But so it was a hazard mitigation project.
It actually, I'll show it to you, but I don't know if anybody has it up. It's actually called. Basically takes this information about the values at risk and the initial analysis and then takes it to a next level, not quite the level that we're talking about here today of getting people on the ground doing all the visual assessment, but it does some additional analysis of some next steps to inform potential mitigation measures.
Okay, yeah. So I was part of that that joint forces operation in 2015. I was there, and what they did, some of the things they did I can mention is that in the Valley Fire burn area and the Butte, they had Army Corps come in and do some additional hydrologic modeling. So they used sort of more up-to-date models to look at flood hazards and an increased runoff in the burn area. And I think that was very helpful, especially when you have approximate FEMA zones here, and then you have some areas where you don't have flood hazard zones mapped. Just because they're not mapped doesn't mean they're not there. So getting Army Corps to step in and help out, that'd be excellent.
Any other questions or comments that we want to make sure while we have all of us here in the room together? Anything else? Carmel, Angela in the back, anything you want to add? Supervisor Brown is here. Anything else you want to add as well? So we really appreciate you guys coming at such short notice again. Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate you all coming as well. I can't remember the name of the report, but it is that. So they're asking now, there's some question of deploying similar resources.